ECIC, your export risk partner.
And as we say goodbye to the live CNBC Africa audience, we want to just say thank you to Godfrey as well. And of course, to our webinar audience, welcome to the second panel discussion of the Africa Trade South Africa virtual conference, where we're going to be exploring trade and investment opportunities offered by the African Continental Free Trade Area. We're looking at opportunities that are ripe for the picking from a South African perspective. My name is Nozipho Tshabalala, and what a pleasure it is to moderate this critically important conversation. Now, South Africa's Minister for Trade and Industry, Minister Ibrahim Patel, reminds us that the African Continental Free Trade Area presents South African producers and manufacturers with an opportunity for expansion into new markets in West, Central, East, and North Africa. He also goes on to say that this provides additional markets for the export of value-added goods and services. And so, in this conversation, we're going to be looking to unpack how we may better position South African industries to supply the free trade area markets and how we might increase the country's manufacturing base. And so, with that, allow me to introduce my panelists. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Mr. William Murwisi. He is the Managing Director of Olympia Factor Commercial. He joins us today, and of course, he is a seasoned entrepreneur, a finance specialist, including, of course, a specialist in trade finance and factoring. He has worked across multiple industries, including telecoms, retail, processing, healthcare, finance, and the list is absolutely endless. So big welcome to Mr. Murwisi. We also are joined by Peter Van Dal. Peter is the CEO of the NEPAD Business Foundation. He is a chartered civil engineer, and he comes into this conversation with extensive experience in infrastructure development, which includes interventions in transport, energy, and the water sectors. His particular focus is on economic development and stakeholder management. So big welcome to Peter as well. We're then also joined by Dr. Stavros Nicolaou, who is a senior executive looking after strategic trade development, and this is for the Aspen Pharmacare Group. And of course, we also know he was previously the CEO of Aspen's export business, which is going to be very important for this conversation. He was, if we remember, quite instrumental in the first generic ARVs that were released on to the continent, developed by Aspen, and which we know today went on to save hundreds and thousands of lives, not only in South Africa, but certainly on the continent as well. So to Dr. Nicolaou, it's a massive welcome to him. We're also joined by Madame Kotsa Katsande. She is Executive Director looking after training and talent management, this at Food Bev International Consulting. She comes into this conversation with over 25 years of international management, as well as hands-on operational experience in food-related businesses across the sub-Saharan Africa region. She's a food scientist and a business executive who's really passionate about improving food safety, quality, and good business management. So it's a massive welcome to all my panelists, and thank you for making the time to join us. And maybe, William, I'm going to kick off this conversation with you. We know that the African Continental Free Trade Area really presents Africa with an opportunity to fast track its industrialization efforts. I'm keen to hear from you what needs to be true for this aspiration to be a reality, for the manufacturing sector in particular to be a key driver of industrialization on the continent broadly, but also specifically for South Africa?
Thank you so much, Nozi. I feel humbled to be part of this panel. My name, as said, is William Murwisi, and I'm more interested in participating in the AfCFTA in terms of the financial aspect of financing exports to improve intra-Africa trade. But for us to appreciate how ACFTA can improve industrialization, we need first to appreciate its benefits. I'm the least experienced or seasoned to say them all, but I'll share with the panel what I have taken to be the most important ones. I happen to have been lucky to participate in African Export-Import Bank's first intra-African trade fair held in Egypt in 2018. This trade fair is also a brainchild of Africa Union through ACFTA. For us to appreciate that, let's go back to South Africa. Who are its international trade and what does it trade in terms of percentages? South Africa is open to international trade, which represents 59.2% of the country's GDP. Main exports being platinum, 9.3%, motor vehicles, 7.5%, iron ores, 6.5%. These statistics may be a bit old and not updated, but they give an indication to what South Africa can do in terms of exports. South Africa's industrialization is currently recognized worldwide. I'm glad we have got Dr. Nicolau from Aspen. Aspen has joined hands with J&J. It is because J&J recognized the industrialization that South Africa can do and contribute to the global world in terms of industrialization, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and everything. The benefits of intra-Africa trade are many. And whilst we acknowledge that the pandemic has brought a lot of uncertainty in the world economy, South Africa has not been spared the same challenges. However, factoring as a finance instrument has actually come to cushion the impact of global trade. One example of such opportunities is the fact that banks are not offering new credit. They've cut on their credit due to the uncertainty, and they require collateral security. But factoring brings a lot of comfort to traders because they don't require collateral. All they require is a supply contract and assignment of the invoice, and trade can be done. From accounting perspective, factoring is not a loan. Therefore, big companies like Aspen will not be affected in terms of their gearing if they use factoring. The question that needs to be answered now is, can South African industrialization be improved? Yes, indeed, it can be improved. And to improve it, it needs finance, and finance in many aspects. We have got in South Africa IDC, which has done a lot in financing some of these projects. We are aware, a part of the Aspen's J&J collaboration, that there is also a project taking place on some of the shores of South Africa called the Nyanza Project. This has also required finance, and there are financial institutions that are driving this process, which needs to be supported by a policy framework. For manufacturing sector to drive industrialization, South Africa needs to look at business, how it's financed, the products that are available. I've mentioned factoring, but there's also export and development finance. There's project finance. The list is endless. All that needs to be done is to rope in all the stakeholders, financiers, business people, manufacturers, marketers, infrastructure, to make sure that there is smooth flow of access to borders, at borders by cargo transporters, road, rail, or air. The challenges needs to be smoothened. I speak to you with the experience that in East Africa, people from Rwanda were taking 23 days to get their goods from Mombasa. But the leaders of those countries combined together, had an indaba, and they managed to reduce from 23 days the lead time to 5 days. In South Africa, we know Southern Africa, we know the SADC countries under the auspices of Africa Union are trying to have a free passage at borders for everybody, for the business people. Much as that is a noble idea, it is taking long to realize. South Africa has done its part when it was chairing the African Union, and I think if industrialization can be financed, they will produce more goods, and more goods can be exported. That's the growth and the ACFTA volumes that we need to see.
Thank you very much, William. I think it's if I can just pause it there for a moment, and I certainly will come back to further unpack some of the themes that I'm sure you want to share with us. But I've heard, you putting forward a really good framework for us to think about, and that is to say, if the manufacturing sector is really going to live up to its promise, we've got to take a whole of society, whole of business, whole of government approach and really look at the broader value chain. You've spoken about finance, you've spoken about policy, you've spoken about making sure that there's market access, and I don't doubt that there are going to be a number of variables that we're going to have to consider if we're going to make this free trade market actually count in the South African context. But what you also did is that you put the baton at the feet of Stavros. So I want to go to him next, as you were mentioning some of the work that they've done in their partnership with J&J. And maybe, Stavros, I want us to pause and consider the fact that, the manufacturing sector is always perceived and seen as the sector that creates jobs, that deepens local value chains, that really encourages the growth of the service economy, that embeds intellectual property like no other sector can. And so the question to you is, what does the South African manufacturing sector need to be able to live up to all of these aspirations?
So, Nazi, firstly, thanks very much for having me on the program. It's a great pleasure to interact with other panelists on this critical topic. I think a good starting point actually is if we reflect on our own situation in South Africa, with unemployment rates being at record highs, a pedestrian economy, very little international trade during the COVID period. So our economy, of course, is not in good shape. And I think we've seen historically those nations, whether it's those that were recovering post the Second World War, or Asian tigers, or many other examples that we could rehearse and recite today, many of them placed manufacturing at the front and center of either their economic recovery or their economic growth. And this is where the African Free Trade Agreement does present an opportunity for our country. It's certainly no exaggeration to say that we've seen significant deindustrialization in our country. If you look at the last 2 decades, the contribution of manufacturing to GDP has almost halved. Now, that's not a statistic we're awfully proud of as South Africa. In fact, in these times, as you emerge from a post-COVID, very often post-COVID ruins, I guess, in many instances, what we should be doing is we should be saying, well, how do we internally localize, reindustrialize, and how do we also leverage African volumes to assist with this reindustrialization project, as we call it. And that's in effect what we should be doing. So let me just focus on the latter issue for a moment. And I think it would be prudent of me to bring in a pharmaceutical example at this point in time. So I think we know that pharmaceuticals are critical in any continent or country where you have the disproportionality of disease burden that we have on the continent. We have the worst of infectious diseases and the worst of what we call non-communicable diseases like diabetes, etc. So this continent and our country should be manufacturing most of its pharmaceuticals. Yet, if you look at the trade statistics, the trade deficit in pharmaceuticals grows year on year. Now, that's going to confound just about everyone, as it confounds me, because there's not a single politician in South Africa that in the last 18 months during COVID hasn't said we need to localize and have our own security of supply of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. Yet, at an implementation level, we are failing to implement the localization policies of our country, regrettably. And pharmaceuticals is an excellent case study. So let me make my last point. If you really want me to drive this point home, it's well known by now, it's been written about extensively and well recorded that the vaccine unevenness and inequality is manifest. Africa is at the back of the queue. The world has administered over 6 billion doses of COVID vaccines, yet Africa's only administered 150 million of those. So less than 2% of what has been administered by way of COVID vaccines globally has found its way into African arms. But yet Africa is a big continent, 1.3 billion population, and we need to vaccinate 750 million Africans to try and get epidemiological containment, as we call it. Now, we should be using the African Free Trade Continental Agreement and those volumes that reside on our continent. They should be aggregated so that we create markets for our own countries in Africa. We shouldn't be aggregating those volumes to create markets elsewhere in Asia and in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a nonsensical approach for me. So what do we need to do in conclusion? I think we need to do two things. First of all, we need to implement localization policy, which we are failing to do right now. And this happens at the level of officials, for example. And we need to call out these departments and those ministries that are not implementing government policy. So that's number one. Number two, we need to aggregate African volumes so that we can use our own economies of scale to galvanize the reindustrialization project in our own country and on the continent.
Stavros, it's an excellent response, and one I don't doubt that we're going to be able to double click into a little bit more. You've given us two solutions, and that's to intensify localization policy, calling out government departments that are not towing the policy line, and of course aggregating volumes for ourselves on the African continent. But I suppose what I'm hearing you say is that the broader opportunities, the opportunity at revisiting our reindustrialization strategy from a market by market, region by region, and eventually at a continental level. Some of the numbers that you shared from a South African perspective are certainly confounding, as you've said. A 50% drop in terms of year-on-year contribution to GDP raises a lot of questions in the context of this conversation, but potentially also perhaps opportunities. You spoke about manufacturing being at the center of growth and recovery, and I want to zone in on the recovery element later on in the conversation. But Peter, let me come to you next, because we've listened to William and Stavros sort of painting for us some of the challenges that they're observing in their line of work, and I'm keen to get an understanding almost from a regional or continental point of view. What is the positioning of South African industries in relation to the African Continental Free Trade Area? And do you think that there are specific challenges that this raises because of South African industries' positioning, and or particular opportunities that we should be looking towards?
Yeah, thanks, Nozipho, and thanks so much for having me, and a pleasure to be sharing this with the colleagues. Yeah, it's been quite a nice build-up. I think we've had the finance aspect, we've had the manufacturing aspect, and I guess what I'll focus on is more the supply chain aspect. So, it's no secret that South Africa is a gateway. It's a major hub, both from the perspective of manufacturing, but from an offtake perspective as well for other countries. So, it is a key node within the regional integration agenda. Within the context of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, I think we've all recognized that this is something that's going to be developing over time. I think we're all still trying to grapple with what it means to all of us and what benefits it brings. But I think the thing that is absolutely clear is that in order for it to be successful, there's a couple of key components that you need to deal with. And the first being just dealing with non-tariff barrier issues, customs issues, cross-border issues, and genuine commitment by governments across the economic corridors that South Africa is part of. As a gateway country to the rest of the region, we need to be delivering value both to people that are importing our product and those that are exporting to us. And value means cost effectiveness. So if we can bring down the time that was spoken about earlier, time is not just a function of I think Mr. Mwisi mentioned earlier, the 23 days in East Africa. That's quite often a function of fixed infrastructure, but also importantly, cross-border challenges. So anything where you can bring down that time will have a massive impact on delivering value to customers. The second part is regional infrastructure itself. We need fit-for-purpose infrastructure that allows us to get goods to market in an efficient manner. I think most people say that our infrastructure is not great. I think generally, if you speak to people moving goods across the region, they'll say it's okay as long as you fix your borders first and have some commitment around your borders. Then you'll start to sort of find the other bottlenecks further on the road. So let's fix our border posts. Let's get this concept of single entry border posts fixed, and then you'll find that our infrastructure will need to improve as a consequence. And the area is just around regional value chains. Stavros has already touched on it from a pharmaceutical perspective. What are the priorities for the region? If you look at the African Union, if you look at SADC, they pretty much mirror each other in terms of what the opportunities are and where the focus areas should be. So Stavros dealt with the pharmaceutical area, and there's a lot of policy issues that we need to deal with to make sure we properly unlock the opportunity around regional value chains there. But similarly, there's also opportunities in the mineral value chains, mineral processing, particularly copper and the like. It comes out of the DRC and Zambia. What are the opportunities around that we can maximize in this move towards green economies? And then finally, the agricultural sector is the big hub of Africa. I think there's a lot of opportunities already identified. I know that the DTRC has been working together with Zambia to try to understand what are some of the mutual opportunities of trade between the two countries, and how do we now use our infrastructure and our customs authorities to better unlock those opportunities and deliver value. I'll stop there for now. Thank you, Nozipho.
Yeah, Peter, I think it's some really good criteria for what it's going to take for this continental free trade area to have impact and meaning in the South African context. And there are two things that stand out for me in your list, two themes. The one is that I think every single thing you've stated requires some degree of political will. And in the absence of that political will, the lifting of non-tariff barriers, the fixing of border posts, the harmonization of regional infrastructure, all of those things then become question marks. But also it's about the deliberateness. So being deliberate about, making sure that value chains are offering values both up and down the value chain, import and export, looking very deliberately at some of those opportunities. And I'm hoping that we're going to get time to come back and just click in there, Peter, to really understand whether there's best practice examples that we should be lifting, whether it's the continent or the world, where we've really seen a country show up with that political will, show up with the policies that are required, and have really been able to unlock opportunity for industry as a result of a free trade market opportunity. But before I do that, let me go to Kotza next. And, Kotza, we've listened to the gentleman talking about the challenges, talking about the financing, talking about the opportunities. I really want to talk about the practical, because you've got your feet, your boots are on the ground in the manufacturing space, and I'm keen to understand from your point of view the state of food manufacturing and what is the reality that food manufacturing is encountered with as you try to trade in the region and on the continent, because it's when we really dig into practical examples that we're able to lift the pebbles and really get a nuanced understanding of the real challenges and the real opportunities. Kotza.
Thank you so much, Nozipho. and I'm also excited to be on this panel, and thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I will talk about what I'm really passionate about when it comes to the industry here in Africa, and also looking at the opportunities out there to trade internationally. In the food industry, yes, we are doing well in Africa, I think, and we have opportunities to develop further. But I want to quickly rush into my area of expertise where we talk about implementing of food safety management systems for the food industry, and also talk about quality management to improve the quality of the products that we will be manufacturing or processing, or whether we are producing, depending on where we are in the food chain. So very important topic that you have brought today. I'm excited about that reindustrialization process. And what we need to focus on is also in terms of improving the food safety management systems, especially in the food industry, for us to gain access into all these international markets, even the regional markets and the continental markets. We want to talk about food safety certification and standardization through systems such as HACCP, hazard analysis critical control point, and also talk about implementation of food safety management systems such as ISO 22000. This is an international standard that can be implemented. Even here in South Africa, we've started on that. Some of the food manufacturers have started on that. But we also do not need to leave behind some of the small businesses, the small to medium scale enterprises. We need to focus on that if we want to get mileage in what we want to achieve in this project. Also, we can talk about FSSC 22000, the certification systems that is out there that can be implemented, and many other systems that can be implemented to improve food safety. We know our consumers are now increasingly being aware of the need of safe food out there, and there's that demand for food safety. So very important to be looking at that. The food industry, yes, is thriving, and we see there's potential, but we need to implement systems to support our production processes, our processing capacities, and so forth. So very important. And also we need to be talking about implementing of quality management systems such as ISO 9001. These are critical if we want to improve the quality of our products. So in a nutshell, Nozi, maybe I can say we need a culture for our food manufacturers to improve. We need to be talking about improving food safety, talking about improving quality of our products to make sure that we excel in this endeavor that we are embarking on. Perhaps I can stop here, but I want to emphasize also the issue of building capacity for our small to medium enterprises. We have a program that we have seen, which we have been working on in Zambia, in Ethiopia, where we are talking about GFSI, Global Markets Program, that facilitate access to export markets and also to markets locally, and there be markets also regionally and continental.
Kotsa, I do want to follow up because I think you've raised something very, very important. As you talk about a culture of certification and standardization, you speak about making sure that we're inclusive in our manufacturing capability building and making sure that we're not leaving small businesses behind. So maybe first a reflective point, that reflection around culture and capacity are two things that we shouldn't forget. But also, just to maybe follow up with you, is that, oftentimes one would imagine that small and medium-sized enterprises are the ones that are going to struggle the most with certification and standardization relative, to example, to big business. How do we better support small and medium-sized enterprises towards certification and standardization, if especially that is the pathway to new markets?
Yes. You see, the GFSI Global Markets Program, it's a very good program that works for the small to medium scale enterprises because it gives you basic checklists and intermediate checklists that the small businesses can be trained on and capacitated to at least improve the practices that they have in their plants, and also to improve, obviously, the procedures that they are using to improve their product in terms of food safety and quality. So we have a program that leads actually to certification. So this is the smallest level where you can start just to implement the minimum requirements and develop from there. And hoping from all this funding, the projects that I'm hearing here, I'm sure that can be harnessed to assist the small businesses and the medium scale enterprises.
Kot, it's excellent. I want to make my way back to William because, William, I think this conversation would be incomplete if we didn't bring in the context of the global pandemic into this conversation. I mean, one of the things that I've enjoyed listening to, I think Stavros was speaking about manufacturing being at the core or at the center of growth and recovery. But if we were to be deadly honest, we know that from a South African perspective, even before the pandemic, that we were not on the path of prosperity and industrialization if we look at our manufacturing activity. So I suppose the question to you is, if we're now going to look at how do we ensure that manufacturing is part of the solution, part of the recovery, fits into what Stavros has described as our re-industrialization efforts, what would you highlight as perhaps the 2 or 3 most important things that we've got to get right if we're going to boost trade and boost competitiveness?
Thank you, Nozi. I would say policy frameworks, financial systems, collaboration of all stakeholders involved. We have got financial entities that work to develop industry in South Africa. We have got DBSA, we have got IDC, we have got PIC, although it's an investment entity, but it also takes investments in the industrial perspective. So those things are key, but if we have only those, we will still not have addressed the issue that one of my fellow panelists mentioned in terms of access to markets, border movement, liberalization policies. So policy is huge. I think in the last speaker's presentation, you asked a question, how do we capacitate these SMMEs? Using policy framework, we could actually go and say, let's have the Public Enterprises Ministry to run a proof of concept project that targets deliberately people with potential SMMEs, form them into cooperatives, because one of the major problems stifling exports is the fact that as Africans, we are too individualistic in our approach to business. So a small enterprise cannot fill a 20-foot container to export, and yet it is manufacturing goods that are needed in high demand elsewhere. So if people could collaborate, formed into cooperative units, they would actually go ahead and deliver at least a container, put 5 farmers together. And agro-processing is one thing that policy could also address, because why should South Africa export grain, maize grain, when it could export cereals, Kellogg cereals? I pause there.
It's a beautiful place to pause, and I must say, I must admit, I'm quite astounded by this really, really apt comment you've just made. You know, you talk about Africans being individualistic, and when we pause and we think about it, oftentimes Africans are always described in the collective and in the community, but you're raising such an important blind spot that when it comes to the way we do business, when it comes to how we aggregate and pool our powers so that we can unlock more markets and unlock more volumes, we seem to do the opposite of what is naturally African, and we go the individualistic route, and that's where we miss the mark, with smallholder farmers absolutely unable to fill an entire container with goods. But what I'm also hearing you say as you speak about collaboration, which is so important, and I want to do a quick follow-up to you, William, on this, is that, you know, when we talk about the whole of government as an example, do you think that we could be a lot more deliberate about really, and I'm going to use the word lightly, forcing collaboration between the DFIs, between some of the funding bodies, between some of the government institutions, so that we are really being deliberate about pooling the strength that gives us that bargaining power in the world?
I think that question is a bit tricky. I'll give you my personal, not professional opinion on this. My view is giants like Aspen, Dr. Nicolau, when they do manufacture drugs, lately there's been liberalization and regulation of data cropping. They could actually start by targeting out growers that they identify to fit into making data oil. And it doesn't have to be coercion, it has to be persuasive. And we'll be surprised if people are given the right forum and the right place to discuss how even big giants like Aspen are the first ones through their corporate social responsibility programs to say, we can do this for the African continent. But the point I mentioned about being individualistic in business, it's a result of lack of trust, driven by lack of information. And whilst we read, I believe we can read more to understand some of these business ethics through associations, collaborations with business chambers, just to mention a few.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, William. My intention was to go to Peter next, but Stavros, I've got to bring you in with this example of the liberalization of cannabis as just one of the ways that we could be opening up safe spaces to have conversations around products. But I really want you maybe to also comment, Stavros, on, you know, particular economic and industrial policy. I think we're using we're using policy loosely, industrial or economic. But if you were to put a proposal in front of the relevant ministers, what are the 3 policy pivots or policy changes that you think would have a definitive impact on how South Africa is able to take advantage of the free trade area?
No, Nozipho, I'm going to preface my response by sort of weighing in on William's earlier thematic. I'm not going to repeat where we are with the state of the economy. I think it's all well known to all of us. What are the 2 things, before I respond directly to your question, what are the 2 things that I believe could change the trajectory of the economy in South Africa? The first is that we seem to have lost a culture of entrepreneurship. And I'm going to say something slightly controversial here. Social grants and basic income grants have a very important role to play in society, but we shouldn't become a country or a continent of dependence, where you're depending on others. We have to turn that around and say, well, how do we invest socioeconomically speaking, that we inculcate a culture of entrepreneurs in the country? Imagine what our economy would look like if we were to deliver another 200,000-300,000 entrepreneurs. Now, it's very difficult for entrepreneurs in our own country. Black industrialists, for example. In my sector, the Black industrialists are not being given any space. And the reason is partly related to what I was discussing earlier, that there is no policy implementation on localization. So let's take these state contracts. I'm going to use the antiretroviral contract as a good example. Antiretrovirals are the single biggest state contract in our country. It's a contract worth around 20 billion rand. We, as a country, consume every month around 6 million packs of antiretrovirals. Yet we'll end up importing around 65 or 70% of those. And now any Black entrepreneur, pharmaceutical Black entrepreneur that wants to go into this business is quite honestly on a hiding to nothing, because these 2 or 3 year contracts where you tilt the scales in favor of importers are never going to give a break to a Black pharmaceutical industrialist that is budding, that wants to get into this business. So we need a strategic rethink, as happens in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, they say we're going to localize 50% of the pharmaceutical industry by 2025 or whatever the date is. And you then get into these long-term contracts with guaranteed offtakes. It allows you to retain your existing capacity for players like an Aspen and others, but it also allows you the space to bring in black entrepreneurs now for the first time. And then you can have DFIs that will want to fund those entrepreneurs. Right now, no DFI is going to go and fund someone on these erratic 2-year or 3-year contracts. It's counterintuitive, and it's destructive to both prospects and existing capacities. So let me answer your question directly. What are the 3 things I would do? Number one, I would properly implement localization and local procurement. It's not been properly, not only in pharmaceuticals. I can go through a series of sectors where this is not being implemented. And if anyone needs any evidence, just look at our current account deficit and what the trade deficit of the country contributes towards it. We should be picking off sector by sector those highly imported products and saying, how do we localize those? How do we reindustrialize to create that capacity? Because manufacturing creates both up and downstream activities.
Yeah.
It is the single biggest contributor, multiplier contributor back into any economy. That's what we should be doing. So number one, we need to implement the localization policy. Number two, we need to have a plan around what I would call a phased reindustrialization, where we've lost industrial capacity. And that would involve working systematically through all these products that make up, let's say, the top 300 most imported products. And we can do this through technology transfers later on. We can start off in initial stages of manufacturing and then build it up. And then my last thing is that there is still a significant mismatch between the skill set that people leave universities with. When I say people, I mean graduates, or even school leavers after matric, versus the jobs that are going to be created out there. That mismatch still exists.
Yeah.
And we need to bring those 2 elements a lot closer together. And again, localization and local manufacturing presents that opportunity.
Yeah.
Because manufacturing does require a particular experiential on-the-job skills competency.
Yeah.
And manufacturing provides that opportunity again. So those are the 3 things I would be doing.
So Stavros, it's localization, it's phased reindustrialization, and of course it's closing the skills mismatch, which we know is so prominent and prevalent on the African continent. I've given everybody 2 shots at the question except for Peter. So Peter, I'd love to give you an opportunity as a closing soundbite here. And that is to say, having heard all that we've heard today, are there best practice examples where we've seen a country really make the right decisions from a policy perspective, from a culture of entrepreneurship perspective, from a collaboration perspective, as William was saying, and really seeing how the manufacturing sector has become not only the growth driver of the economy, but also potentially the driver of the recovery, whether it's in this crisis or future crises. Do we have an example to look to that we should be studying more closely?
Sure, I've never really thought about it specifically, but perhaps if I could offer one, I think there is this experience of the Romco pipeline, which is a natural gas solution between Mozambique and South Africa, effectively supplying Secunda and Sasol's operations in Secunda. And I think that's a fantastic model of cross-border infrastructure that has been able to create a massive manufacturing capability around natural gas. So, yeah. My understanding, when that was done, it was done when there weren't policy frameworks in place, but it was done largely due to commitment and political will to make sure that project happened. So I'm sure that there'll be lots learnings from that particular process, that project, that could be worthy of us looking at.
Yeah, Peter, I think it comes all the way back to where we started off in the conversation to say, do we have the commitment to make the required decisions and trade-offs and the political will as well to make sure that we're pushing through even with the more difficult things? Because what we're hearing in this conversation is that if the manufacturing sector is really going to be an enabler of South Africa taking advantage of the African Free Continental Free Trade Area, we're certainly going to have to see more intentional and deliberate action around this particular opportunity. And so at this point, I'd really like to thank my guests for having joined me in this discussion. That's, of course, Mr. William Murwisi, who is, of course, the Managing Director at Olympia Factor Commercial, Peter Van Dal, the CEO of the NEPAD Business Foundation, Dr. Stavros Nicolaou, Senior Executive looking after strategic trade development at the Aspen Pharma Care Group, and Madame Kotsa Katsande, the Executive Director for Training and Talent Management, and this at Foodbev International Consulting. Thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. We keep the conversations alive and robust and insightful as we continue, of course, looking at what the African Free Continental Free Trade Area could mean for South Africa. This is the opportunity to unlock a multi-trillion-dollar market. It, of course, all comes back to the decisions, the actions that we could and should be taking. For now, it's goodbye.
ECIC, your export risk partner.